I need you guys to understand. I need you to understand how painful this is. I need you to understand how painful it is to be reminded every day that your race means nothing. And that isn't the case anymore. That is never the case anymore. We are going to try today. We are a physical representation of our support for George Floyd.
Bang on them! Bang on them! Bang on them!
We are a physical representation on our support for Sandra Bland.
Bang on them!
We are a physical representation on our support for Trayvon Martin. We are a physical representation of our support for Stephen Lawrence. For Mark Duggan. Black men, we need to take care of our black women. We need to take care of them. They are ours. They are our hearts. They are our future. We cannot demonize our own.
Amen.
We are the pillars of the family. Imagine this, a nation that is set up with individual families that are thriving, that are healthy, that communicate, that raise their children in love, have a better rate of becoming better human beings. Black lives have always mattered. We have always been important. We have always meant something. We have always succeeded, regardless. And now is the time. I ain't waiting. I ain't waiting.
The Black Lives Matter movement has inspired countless people worldwide to protest and advocate for equal rights for minorities. It is a movement of emotion and fear. Minorities fear for their lives because of America's institutionalized racism. This movement echoes the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. These movements also have their fair share of similarities. To understand these movements, we must look back at some key events of the civil rights movement. We must dive into the civil rights movement's history and some of its key events to see how these issues have progressed now in 2020. The first movement that sparked the civil rights movement was Brown versus the Board of Education, a Supreme Court case. The 13th Amendment put an end to slavery after the Civil War, and the 14th Amendment strengthened Black Americans' rights. But these amendments did not stop discrimination from occurring. Institutions segregated blacks from whites. They could not ride in the same seats as whites, they had to go to different movie theaters and stores, and they even had to use different water fountains. Brown versus Board of Education was sparked by segregation in public schools. This event consisted of 5 court cases: Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Briggs versus Elliott, Davis versus Board of Education of Prince Edward County, Bowling versus Sharp, and Gebhardt versus Ethel. The article states, on May 14, 1954, he delivered the opinion of the court, stating that, we conclude that in the field of public education the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, which deems segregation in schools unconstitutional. However, it took many years for schools to desegregate, and even then, there are still many schools that still need to desegregate. The next events that we will be looking at are the Little Rock Nine and Ruby Bridges. The Little Rock Nine were 9 teenagers in Arkansas that were barred from going to an all-white school. This event took place in 1957, 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education. The article states, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus ordered the state's National Guard to block their entrance. The next day, a federal judge ordered that the 9 students could attend the school, but a day later, a mob and the National Guard prevented them from attending the school. After 16 days, another judge removed the National Guard, but another angry mob blocked attempted rushing into the school. So the students were sent home by the school staff. 2 days later, Dwight Eisenhower federalized the National Guard and sent U.S. Army troops to the scene. Personally guarded by soldiers from the National Guard, soldiers and the Army's 101st Airborne, the Little Rock Nine began regular class attendance at Central High. But this did not stop the discrimination. The 9 were harassed by most of the white students at the school, proving that true equality was still far away. At the age of 6, Ruby Bridges was chosen to enroll into William Frantz Elementary School, along with 6 other children. Bridges was the only one that was selected to enroll. The article states, on November 14, 1960, her first day, she was escorted to school by 4 federal marshals. However, Bridges did not attend class that day. She spent the whole school day in the principal's office as infuriated parents removed their children from the school because they did not want their children to attend school with a black child. Bridges was accompanied by marshals every day. She was harassed and insulted by the school students in the school and parents in a crowd outside of the school, protesting Bridges' enrollment into the school. But as the article states, toward the end of the year, the crowds began to thin, and by the following year, the school had enrolled several more black students, demonstrating that Ruby Bridges had carved a path for more black students to enroll. Bridges also brought another milestone for the civil rights movement. Even though the civil rights movement made huge leaps in schools desegregation, the fight is still not over today. The segregation of public schools has been unconstitutional for quite some time now. But according to Browne-Marshall, 20 years later, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, and Kansas City schools are resegregating. A report from UCLA's Civil Rights Project and the Center for Education and Civil Rights found that in 2016, 50% of African American students nationwide were in schools with 90% or more students of color. Despite the advances in equal rights for all, there's still prejudice held by people. Segregated schools were deemed unconstitutional in 1954, but almost 70 years later, people are still segregating schools. I could not have said it better than Browne-Marshall, who stated, "The benefit of desegregation, then and now, is the breakdown of racial stereotypes. This diverse nation cannot afford to live in silos of distrust and ignorance of one another." Both the Black Lives Matter movement and the Civil Rights movement emphasized nonviolent protest, but just because a protest starts violently does not mean it will become violent. The first protest we will be looking at is the Selma March. The Selma March was actually 3 separate marches, 2 of them ending with violence from the police. They were protesting for the rights for African Americans to vote. This protest was a turning point in the Civil Rights movement. The most famous of these marches is Bloody Sunday. The march took place on March 7, 1965. It was led by John Lewis, and Martin Luther King Jr. would join the protesters later because he was preaching at Ebenezer Baptist Church. The article stated, "Before departing Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Selma on Sunday morning, marchers were reminded of their nonviolent tactics, that if they were halted, they should sit and pray until tear gassed or arrested," showing that these protests were, indeed, meant to be nonviolent. At the east end of the Pettus Bridge, the police confronted the marchers and the marchers were told that they had 2 minutes to disperse. Jose Williams, one of the leaders of the march, asked to talk with the officer that had given them the command, but the officer responded with that there was nothing to talk about. And then he ordered the other officers to advance on the protesters. The protesters were tear gassed and beaten by the officers, and the protesters were completely defenseless. 50 protesters were injured after the march. There were television cameras there which broadcasted the violence from the police officers to American homes. A week later, Lyndon B. Johnson, the President of the United States at the time, introduced legislation to Congress that gave African Americans better voting rights. The next event we will be looking at is the protest by Black Lives Matter about the murder of George Floyd by a police officer. Many of these protests were met with police brutality despite the protesters' peaceful intentions. These protests had widespread incidents of police violence, including punching, kicking, gassing, pepper spraying, and driving vehicles at often peaceful protesters in states across the country, showing that the police did not care about these protesters' intentions. Much like the Selma March, many of these events were captured through cameras, whether TV cameras or cameras on protesters' phones. These events were displayed on the news, YouTube, and other sites like Twitter. Like the Selma marches, this caused these protests to garner national attention, putting pressure on legislators to make a change. And again, like the Selma marches, national legislation was passed by the government to stop violence like this. For example, several states passed bans on the use of tear gas and chokeholds by police. Some states mandated body cameras to be used by police officers. Other states have passed laws that make more transparency from police and other reforms for police forces across the country. Overall, the Black Lives Matter movement has been inspired by a lot from the Civil Rights Movement, and both movements have similarities. Even though there have been significant strides in civil rights, the work is not yet complete. There are still many other injustices and prejudices that occur every day now, and the job will not be finished until more reforms are passed. There are still many cases that have yet to see justice that I have not covered, like the murder of Breonna Taylor and many others.